Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dr. Creepy. In tonight's episode, we're heading deep into 10 most disturbing true Appalachian Mountains horror stories, unsettling accounts from remote trails, forgotten hollows, abandoned camps, and dense mountain forests where help is miles away and the land feels far too aware of your presence. From trail markers that don't stay where they're placed, to voices heard deep in the woods where no one should be, to paths that seem to stretch longer the farther you walk, these encounters happened in one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world, where the wilderness doesn't just surround you, it remembers. If you're new here, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss new true horror stories. Now get comfortable and let's start. I have hiked the Appalachian Mountains most of my adult life. I am not a thrill seeker, and I do not chase legends or folklore. I hike because the mountains are quiet in a way that cities never are, and because when you spend enough time out there, the rules of the world feel simpler. Trails go where they are marked. Campsites stay where they are placed. If you follow the blazes, you will eventually come out somewhere familiar. That belief carried me into the longest and worst week of my life. I entered the trail in late October, just after the leaves had finished falling. The forest was stripped bare, all grays and browns, the ground covered in wet leaves that muffled sound. It was the kind of stillness that feels peaceful at first and then slowly becomes unsettling when you realize how far it stretches. I was planning a solo hike of a lesser-used section of the Appalachian Range in western North Carolina. Nothing extreme. 5 days at a steady pace with mapped shelters and marked campsites along the way. The first 2 days passed exactly as expected. The trail markers were clear, the weather was cool but dry, and I saw only one other hiker, an older man moving in the opposite direction, who nodded but did not stop. I reached my second campsite just before sunset, pitched my tent near a fire ring, and cooked dinner while the forest darkened around me. That was the first night I noticed the marker. Every established campsite along that section of trail has a wooden post set nearby, painted with the white blaze that confirms you are where you are supposed to be. When I arrived, the post stood a few yards to the left of the clearing, angled slightly toward the trail. I remember noticing it because one corner of the paint had peeled, exposing gray wood underneath like a scab. I slept poorly that night. The forest was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere downslope, something large moved through leaves, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was a deer or a bear passing through, and eventually drifted off. In the morning, as I packed my gear, I noticed the trail marker again. It was no longer beside the clearing. It stood several yards farther back, closer to the tree line, almost directly behind my tent. At first, I assumed I had misremembered its position. Memory is unreliable, especially after a restless night. I shrugged it off, finished packing, and stepped onto the trail. By midday, I reached a ridge with a long, open view of the valley below. The weather shifted quickly, clouds rolling in low and heavy, the light dimming even though it was still early afternoon. I checked my map and compass and decided to push on to the next campsite rather than stop early. I wanted to stay on schedule. When I arrived at the third campsite, I felt that faint, instinctive discomfort that hikers learn to respect. The clearing was there, the fire ring intact, but the space felt wrong, as if something had been rearranged while I was gone. I could not have explained it clearly if asked. It was not fear exactly, just the sense of stepping into a room after an argument has taken place. The trail marker stood at the edge of the clearing, but this one was different. The paint was fresh, too white, too clean. It did not show the wear I expected. Still, I told myself that maintenance crews must have replaced it recently. That night, the forest was not quiet. Branches snapped at irregular intervals, always just far enough away that I could not pinpoint the sound. Once, I heard what might have been footsteps circling the clearing, slow and heavy, but when I shone my headlamp outward, the trees stood empty. I slept in fragments, waking again and again with the sense that something had shifted while I was unconscious. In the morning, the trail marker had moved. It stood directly at the head of the trail now, blocking the narrow path forward. It had not fallen. It had not tilted. It stood upright, planted firmly in the ground, facing away from the clearing, as if pointing me onward. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that someone had been through the campsite overnight. A ranger, another hiker, anyone. But there were no footprints in the damp soil, no disturbed leaves, no sign of human presence besides my own. I moved the marker myself, dragging it several feet to the side of the trail. It was heavier than I expected, the base packed with dirt and stones. When I let go, it remained where I placed it. That should have ended it. By midday, the trail narrowed as it descended into a thick stand of trees. The fog settled in, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. The world shrank to the sound of my boots on leaves and my breath inside my jacket. I reached a junction that was not on my map. Two trails branched away from the main path, both marked with the same white blaze. I checked my map again, tracing the route with my finger. There was no split here. There should not have been a choice. The marker stood between the paths, perfectly centered, as if waiting for me to decide. I chose the left trail. It began normally enough, sloping gently downward, but after an hour, I noticed the trees growing closer together, the canopy tightening overhead. The forest pressed inward, the light dimming further, and the air felt warmer, thicker, as though the ground itself was breathing. When I finally stopped to rest, I realized the trail marker was ahead of me again. It stood at the edge of a small clearing I had not seen moments earlier. The white paint was smudged now, streaked with something dark that might have been mud or rot. I did not approach it. I turned around instead. The trail behind me was gone. Leaves covered the ground in every direction, unbroken, undisturbed. There was no sign of the path I had just walked. Panic crept in slowly, the way cold does when it seeps through wet clothing. I forced myself to breathe steadily and took out my compass. The needle spun. I do not mean it wavered or hesitated. It spun freely, circling again and again as if pulled by something beneath the ground. I tried to backtrack, choosing a direction at random, pushing through brush and branches until my arms ached. The forest resisted me. Thorns snagged my sleeves. Roots caught my boots. Every few steps I glimpsed the white blaze ahead, always just far enough away to draw me forward. As evening fell, the woods changed. The sounds returned, closer now, heavier. Something moved parallel to me, unseen but present, pacing my steps. I called out once, my voice thin and swallowed almost immediately by the trees. No answer came, but the footsteps paused, then resumed. I stumbled into another clearing just as darkness settled fully. A fire ring waited at its center, stones arranged carefully, old ash inside. Beside it stood the marker, taller than I remembered, its paint cracked and peeling, the white dulled to a sickly gray. I did not sleep that night. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in hand, listening to movement just beyond the reach of my headlamp. The marker creaked occasionally, wood shifting softly as if adjusting its stance. At dawn, I ran. I did not follow the marker. I did not follow anything. I ran downhill, crashing through undergrowth, sliding on wet leaves, tearing my hands and legs open without noticing the pain. The forest seemed to tilt, the ground sloping impossibly steep, the air growing colder with every step. When I finally broke free of the trees, I collapsed onto a gravel road. A truck stopped. A man got out and stared at me as if I had crawled out of the earth itself. He drove me to the nearest town without asking many questions. I did not offer answers. Days later, once the shock faded, I returned to the ranger station with my map. They listened politely, then showed me their own charts. The junction did not exist. The campsites beyond the second night were not on record. The section of forest I described had no maintained trails at all. Before I left, one of the older rangers stopped me. He asked if I had seen any misplaced markers. When I nodded, he told me quietly that sometimes the mountains rearrange their paths. He said the markers are not for hikers. They are for the forest, to keep track of what goes in and what comes out. I have not hiked alone since. Sometimes late at night, I still dream of white paint peeling in the dark, of a marker standing just behind me, patiently waiting for me to choose a direction again. I grew up in eastern Kentucky, close enough to the Appalachian Mountains that the ridgelines felt less like landmarks and more like walls. The mountains were not romantic where I came from. They were work, weather, and boundaries. You learned where you could go, where you could not, and which places people avoided without ever saying the reason out loud. One of those places was a narrow hollow tucked between two steep ridges about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. It had no official name on maps, but everyone locally called it the Quiet Hollow. Not because it was peaceful, but because sound did not behave correctly there. I heard about it for as long as I could remember. Adults warned children not to wander near it. Hunters skirted around it instead of cutting through. Even dogs refused to track game downhill toward it. When asked why, people would say the same thing in slightly different ways. Noise gets lost down there. As a kid, I assumed it was another story meant to keep us from getting hurt. Appalachian families are full of those. They grow from practical dangers and slowly turn strange over time. I did not believe any of it until the summer I was 16. That year was a hard one. Logging contracts were scarce, and my father picked up what work he could. I spent most days helping neighbors for cash, fixing fences, hauling scrap, or cutting brush. One afternoon, an older man named Lester stopped by our place. He lived alone farther up the mountain and made money trapping small game. He said someone had been stealing his traps and asked if I would help him check the remaining ones. When he mentioned they were set near the Quiet Hollow, I hesitated. Lester noticed and laughed. He told me those stories were nonsense passed down by people who needed something to fear. He said the hollow was quiet because the trees grew thick and the ridges bent the air, nothing more. I wanted the money, and I wanted to prove I was not a kid anymore, so I agreed. We parked his truck at the end of a rutted dirt road and walked the rest of the way. The trail sloped gently downward at first, shaded by tall hardwoods. It was late summer, humid but overcast, the forest heavy with the smell of damp leaves and earth. About 15 minutes in, I noticed something was wrong. The woods were not silent, but they felt muted, like someone had thrown a blanket over them. Birds called, but the sound seemed distant and flat. When I stepped on a branch, the snap felt wrong, too soft, as if the noise had nowhere to go. Lester talked as we walked, complaining about the missing traps, but his voice sounded duller the deeper we went. Not quieter, just wrong, as if it were being absorbed rather than carried. We reached the first trap without issue. The second lay sprung open, chain intact, no fur or blood nearby. The third was gone completely, wire cut cleanly from the tree. Lester cursed and raised his voice, calling out into the woods, accusing whoever might be listening. His words left his mouth, but they did not travel. They simply vanished. That was when I realized I could not hear the creek. I knew it was nearby. I could see water moving between rocks, but it made no sound at all. It was like watching a silent movie of the forest. A tight feeling settled in my chest. I asked Lester if he noticed it too. He nodded, jaw set, but told me to stay calm. He said we would grab what traps remained and leave. Then he saw the drag marks. They cut through the leaves, leading downhill, deeper into the hollow. Lester told me to stay where I was while he followed them. I did not like it, but I trusted him. He had lived in these mountains his whole life. I watched him walk away, his shape shrinking between the trees. He called back once, telling me to keep an eye out. His voice barely reached me, even though he was not far. Then I saw him jerk forward like someone had yanked him by the shoulders. His mouth opened wide. I saw him scream. I heard nothing. Panic hit me all at once. I ran downhill toward him, shouting his name, but my voice felt trapped inside my chest. No sound came out. When I reached the spot where he had been standing, there was no sign of a struggle. No broken branches, no blood. Only the drag marks continued, pressed deeper into the hollow. I followed them because I did not know what else to do. The farther I went, the worse it became. The forest seemed to press inward, trees growing closer together, the light dimming unnaturally. My ears filled with pressure, like descending underwater. Breathing became harder, each breath shallow and unsatisfying. I found Lester sitting against a tree, eyes wide, mouth moving silently. His hands clawed at his throat as if he were choking. I grabbed him, trying to speak, but nothing came out. When I shook him, he pointed past me, hands trembling so badly I could barely tell where he meant. I turned slowly. Something stood between the trees. It did not have a clear shape. The air around it warped, bending the forest inward, as if the world were being pulled toward a center point. When it shifted, the ground did not crunch. Leaves did not move. everything simply seemed to slide. I understood then that it was not silence by accident. Whatever stood there was taking sound, pulling it in, feeding on it. My chest tightened painfully. My ears rang as pressure built until my vision blurred. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding inside my skull, louder than anything else, and I realized with horror that if it took that too, I would not survive. Lester grabbed my arm and pulled. Somehow he found his footing. We stumbled uphill together, half running, half falling. With every step away, the pressure eased slightly. My ears popped painfully, and a rush of sound slammed back into existence all at once. The creek roared, birds screamed, my own voice tore loose in a raw shout. Behind us, the forest remained unnaturally still. We did not stop until we reached the truck. Lester slammed the doors shut and locked them, hands shaking so badly he dropped the keys twice before starting the engine. He did not speak until we were miles away. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse, strained, as if he had screamed himself raw. He told me his grandfather had warned him about that hollow when he was a boy. Said some places in the mountains take things people do not realize they are giving up. Sound, time, names, sometimes people. Lester quit trapping that year. He sold his gear and stayed close to home. I left the mountains not long after. Years passed. I built a life elsewhere. I convinced myself it had been a natural phenomenon, fear amplified by isolation. Last winter, I returned for a funeral. Afterward, I drove out of habit to the old dirt road. I stood at the edge of the trees and listened. Everything sounded normal. Then, beneath it all, I heard something else. Faint, distant. A scream trapped far below the surface of the forest, still being pulled inward, still not finished. I left immediately. Some hollows are quiet for a reason. I first learned about the cabin while working seasonal maintenance in the southern Appalachians. The job was simple on paper: inspect old service trails, check erosion barriers, mark fallen trees, and flag any structures that might pose a hazard to hikers. Most of the work involved long days alone, slow walking, and paperwork no one ever read. The cabin was not on any of my assigned maps. I noticed it late one afternoon while following a narrow spur trail that branched off the main ridge. The trail itself was faint but deliberate, cut into the slope rather than worn naturally by foot traffic. It suggested purpose, not wandering. After about half a mile, the trees thinned and the cabin appeared. It was small, no larger than a single-room hunting shelter, built from hand-hewn logs and roofed with warped tin. What struck me immediately was that the front door faced downhill, directly toward the steepest drop. No one builds like that. In the mountains, you orient structures to block wind, catch light, or face access paths. This cabin ignored all of that. I assumed it was old, possibly abandoned decades earlier, and made a note to photograph it the next day for records. When I returned the following morning, the cabin was still there, but the door faced uphill. At first, I thought I had approached from a different angle. I walked a full circle around the clearing, checking landmarks. The slope, the rock outcroppings, the bent birch near the edge of the trees were all exactly as I remembered. Only the cabin had changed its orientation. I laughed it off, blaming fatigue and poor memory. Still, I took photos from multiple angles and marked the GPS location. That evening, back at the ranger station, I entered the coordinates into our system. Nothing came up, no historical record, no decommissioned structure, no private land claim. I returned on the third day, this time with another ranger named Cole. I did not tell him about the door. I wanted confirmation without suggestion. We found the cabin easily. Cole frowned as soon as he saw it. "That's not right," he said. I asked him what he meant. He pointed at the door. "It's facing sideways to the slope. That makes no sense." My stomach tightened. We circled the structure together. The logs were old but well maintained. No rot, no collapse. The door hung straight, the hinges recently oiled. Inside, the cabin was bare except for a narrow cot and a small iron stove. No dust, no debris, as if someone had been there recently. Cole asked who owned it. I told him it was not on any map. We returned the next day. The door faced downhill again. Cole went quiet. He walked the perimeter 3 times, then checked the ground for signs of movement. There were no tracks. The soil was undisturbed. The cabin had not been dragged or rotated. It simply stood differently. Over the next week, we returned daily. Each time the cabin faced a different direction, sometimes toward the trees, sometimes toward open air, once directly toward the sun despite the time of day. The interior never changed. On the 8th day, Cole refused to go back. He told me some things were not meant to be corrected. He filed a vague report and reassigned himself to another section. I went alone. That morning, the door faced directly toward me. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, a deep unease settling over me. It felt intentional, like being acknowledged. Still, training and stubbornness pushed me forward. I stepped inside. The air was warmer than it should have been. The stove was cold, but the space held heat, stale and human. On the cot lay something new, a folded jacket. It was mine. I knew it instantly. A tear near the cuff, a faded patch sewn inside the collar. I dropped it there days earlier while working another section miles away. I backed out slowly. Behind me, the forest was silent. I did not return the next day. The following week, a hiker went missing near that spur trail. Then another. Search teams found no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away, no reason they should have vanished. Against my better judgment, I returned to the cabin one final time with a search crew. The door faced inward toward the clearing. Inside, the cot was occupied. It was not a body in the normal sense. It was a shape arranged like a person, made from clothing, gear, and fragments of things that had clearly been carried by hikers. Boots without feet, packs without owners, jackets folded around emptiness. The shape turned its head. The door slammed shut behind us. For a moment, I thought we were trapped. Then the cabin creaked, the logs groaning softly. The walls did not move, but the world outside shifted. Through the window, the forest rotated slowly, deliberately, until the door opened again. The clearing was gone. We ran. We did not look back. The cabin was never found again. The spur trail no longer exists. Officially, it was erosion damage, a mapping error corrected quietly. Unofficially, I know better. Some structures in the mountains are not built to shelter people. They are built to face them. I spent 6 years working seasonal trail surveys throughout the central Appalachians. The job involved long stretches alone, documenting erosion, checking signage, and updating trail conditions for routes that barely saw foot traffic anymore. Most of the trails had history behind them: old logging paths, former access roads, game trails widened by decades of use. They all went somewhere, even if that place no longer mattered. The trail I'm writing about did not. It appeared on one map and on no others. I found it while cross-referencing outdated survey charts during a winter assignment. The map was from the late 1970s, hand-annotated, with a faint dotted line marked simply as river access. That caught my attention because no maintained trail reached the river in that section anymore. Steep terrain and frequent flooding had erased most of them decades earlier. Curious, I flagged the location for verification. The following week, I parked at the nearest service road and hiked in. The weather was cold but clear, the forest bare and open. I found the trailhead without trouble. A narrow path dipped downhill between two hemlocks, marked by an old wooden post without paint. The trail felt deliberate, not overgrown, not freshly cut, just maintained enough to suggest regular passage. It descended steadily, following the natural curve of the slope. After about 40 minutes, I realized something was wrong. I should have heard the river by then. Rivers announce themselves long before you see them, even small ones. Sound carries downhill, especially in winter. But there was nothing, no rushing water, no distant echo. I checked my map and continued. The forest changed subtly as I went lower. The trees grew closer together, their trunks darker, their bark slick with moisture. The air felt heavier, as if the hollow trapped it. I noticed that my footsteps sounded duller than expected, absorbed by the ground rather than echoed. After another half hour, I stopped. The trail flattened out, running parallel to where the river should have been. I could smell water, cold, mineral, unmistakable. But there was no sound and no visible stream. I followed the path for another mile. Still nothing. Eventually, the trail ended abruptly at a wide patch of bare earth, dark and wet, as if something had recently receded. The ground sloped gently downward, but there was no bank, no channel, no water, only mud pressed flat and smooth. At the far edge stood a signpost. It was old, wood split with age, but the lettering was legible. It read, "River access, keep moving." I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest was quiet in a way that felt intentional. I took photos, recorded coordinates, and turned back. The hike out took longer than expected. The slope felt steeper going up, the light dimmer even though the sun was still high. When I reached my truck, I felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Back at the station, I checked modern maps. The trail did not exist. The river was marked several hundred yards farther east than where the trail led. I chalked it up to outdated data. 2 weeks later, a hiker went missing in that area. Then another. Both had been experienced. Both had filed routes that followed existing trails. Neither was found. Search teams covered the region extensively. No tracks, no gear, no indication they had fallen or been injured. Eventually, the cases went cold. I did not connect it to the trail at first. That changed when I reviewed one of the missing hikers' GPS logs. The last recorded movement showed a steady descent toward the river, followed by hours of slow, looping movement along a narrow corridor that should not have existed. The path matched the old map exactly. Against my better judgment, I returned to the trail, this time with 2 other rangers. I did not tell them everything. I wanted to observe without influencing their reactions. We found the trailhead again. The wooden post stood exactly where I remembered it. As we descended, one of the rangers commented on how quiet it was. The other mentioned feeling like the forest was closing in. When we reached the mud clearing, the signpost was gone. In its place stood a simple wooden railing, like the kind used near overlooks. Beyond it, the ground sloped downward into darkness. The smell of water was stronger than ever. One of the rangers stepped forward and froze. "There's movement," he said quietly. I stepped beside him and saw it. The ground beyond the railing shifted slowly, like a surface disturbed from below. Ripples passed through the mud, traveling toward us, stopping just short of the barrier. Then a sound began. It was not the rush of water. It was closer to breathing, deep, rhythmic, patient. The ranger beside me leaned forward instinctively, as if drawn by it. I grabbed his pack and pulled him back just as the ground surged upward. Something rose from beneath the mud. Not a shape, not a body, but a void where water should have been. The surrounding earth sagged toward it, pulled inward. The breathing grew louder. We ran. The trail back felt longer, steeper, wrong. The forest seemed to resist us, branches snagging, roots catching boots. The breathing followed, steady and unhurried, never closer, never farther. When we reached the trailhead, the sound stopped abruptly. We did not speak until we reached the vehicles. That section of forest was closed shortly afterward, officially due to unstable ground and erosion risk. The old map was removed from archives. The missing hikers remain unresolved. I still think about that sign, "Keep moving," not a warning, an instruction. Some trails in the Appalachians do not lead to places. They lead to things that are waiting. I worked fire watch one season in the northern Appalachians when I was between jobs and trying to decide whether I was done with outdoor work for good. The position was temporary and underfunded, the kind of role that still exists mostly because it always has. You lived alone in an old tower for weeks at a time, scanned the forest for smoke, logged weather patterns, and checked in by radio at set intervals. It was quiet work, honest work. And I believed that if anything strange had ever happened up there, someone would have mentioned it. The tower sat on a narrow ridgeline overlooking miles of forest in every direction. It was reachable by truck only part of the way. The last stretch had to be hiked, which made supply runs rare and brief. Once you were up there, you stayed. The first week passed without incident. The radio worked, the weather stayed mild, and the forest stretched out beneath me like a still ocean. At night, the lights of distant towns flickered faintly through gaps in the trees. On the 8th night, I heard my name. It came from below the tower, carried faintly on the wind. A single call, spoken clearly and calmly, as if someone stood just out of sight. I froze. People do not wander that far off trail, especially at night. I checked the perimeter with my flashlight. The stairs leading up to the tower were empty. The surrounding trees stood still. I told myself it was the wind shaping sound strangely and went back inside. The next night, it happened again. This time, my name was spoken twice. The voice sounded closer, clearer, unmistakably human. It matched my own voice perfectly. I did not respond. I reported it over the radio the following morning, choosing my words carefully. The dispatcher paused longer than usual before replying. He asked if I had heard anything else. Footsteps, radio interference, animal noise. I told him no. That night, the radio crackled to life on its own. At first, it was only static. Then a voice cut through, distorted but recognizable. It was mine. The transmission repeated a phrase I had spoken earlier that day during a routine check-in, down to the same cadence and pauses. When it finished, the radio went silent. I unplugged it. The forest below the tower felt different after that. Not hostile, but attentive. I caught movement at the edge of my vision more often, though nothing ever stood where I looked. The wind shifted constantly, circling the tower instead of passing through. On the 12th night, I woke to footsteps on the stairs. They climbed slowly, deliberately, stopping just below the trapdoor. I sat up in my bunk, heart pounding, listening as the steps reached the final rung. Someone knocked. The knock was soft, patient, familiar. I did not answer. After several minutes, the footsteps descended. I waited until morning to check the stairs. They were undisturbed. No scuffed paint, no dirt, no sign anyone had been there. I radioed in a request to be relieved early. The dispatcher told me there was no one available for at least another week. That night, the calling started again. This time, it came from multiple directions. My name echoed faintly through the trees, overlapping, slightly out of sync, as if several people were repeating it from memory. Some voices were almost right, others lagged behind, stretching syllables incorrectly. I realized then that the tower itself was amplifying the sound, reflecting it, carrying it back into the forest. I covered my ears and waited for morning. Sleep came only in fragments. Each time I drifted off, I dreamed of standing at the top of the stairs, looking down to see myself climbing toward me, one careful step at a time. On the 15th day, smoke appeared on the horizon. I logged the coordinates and prepared to radio it in. Before I could speak, the radio activated on its own. My voice answered. It reported the fire calmly, accurately, even using my own phrasing. When it finished, the smoke vanished, dissolving into low cloud. I understood then that the tower was not watching for fire. It was listening. That night, the calling was relentless. My name rose from the forest in a steady rhythm, each repetition closer than the last. The stairs creaked beneath unseen weight. I grabbed my pack and descended before I could think better of it. The forest closed around me immediately, the tower lights disappearing behind the trees. The voices followed, guiding me downhill, correcting my path whenever I strayed. I realized with growing dread that they knew the trails better than I did. I ran. Somewhere near dawn, I broke through the tree line onto a service road and collapsed. I did not stop running until I reached the ranger station. The tower was decommissioned the following year, officially due to structural concerns. Unofficially, I heard that radios left inside still transmit on their own, repeating old calls, waiting for someone to answer. I no longer respond when I hear my name in the woods. Some places learn you too well. I was contracted to assist with a boundary resurvey along a remote section of the Appalachian Range that sits near the intersection of 3 counties. The work involved verifying old survey markers, many of which dated back nearly a century, and confirming that property lines still aligned with modern records. It was slow, tedious work, but it paid well, and I preferred being alone in the woods to sitting behind a desk. Survey markers are not mysterious things. They are iron rods, stone cairns, or brass caps set into bedrock, meant to last longer than the people who place them. Once installed, they do not move. That rule matters more than most people realize. The first 2 days went smoothly. I located every marker listed in my documents, confirmed their coordinates, photographed them, and logged their condition. The forest was dense but manageable, and the weather stayed clear. On the 3rd day, I found a marker that was not in my records. It sat at the edge of a shallow ravine, half buried in soil and leaf litter. At first glance, it looked old, a rusted iron rod capped with a worn brass disc. When I brushed it clean, I saw engraved numbers and letters arranged in a format I recognized, but the date was wrong. It read 1921. That alone would not have concerned me, except that my paperwork showed no marker ever placed at that location. More importantly, I had walked that exact stretch of ground the previous afternoon. I remembered it clearly because the slope was steep enough that I had to brace myself against a tree to descend safely. The marker had not been there. I double-checked my GPS, cross-referenced nearby points, and even paced the distance manually. Everything aligned perfectly, except the existence of the marker itself. I logged it as an anomaly and moved on. The next morning, I found another one. This marker stood less than a quarter mile from the first, embedded cleanly in exposed rock. Its brass cap gleamed unnaturally bright, as if recently polished. The engraved date read 1934. By midday, I had found 3 more. All were placed with professional precision. All bore dates that fit historical survey patterns. None were listed in any county, state, or federal record I could access. I radioed my supervisor and explained the situation. He told me to flag the locations and continue my assigned route. He assumed I was uncovering forgotten boundary work, possibly tied to abandoned claims or old timber disputes. That explanation would have satisfied me, if not for what happened next. On the 4th day, I returned to verify the first marker. It was gone. The soil showed no sign of disturbance. Leaves lay undisturbed. The slope looked exactly as it had before, empty of anything artificial. In its place, however, stood another marker less than 10 feet away. The date on this one read 1947. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Survey markers do not appear spontaneously, and they do not replace one another. That night, I camped farther uphill than planned. Sleep came in fits. Several times, I woke with the distinct sensation that something nearby was being measured, assessed, evaluated. I heard faint metallic sounds echoing softly through the trees, like tools striking stone far away. At dawn, I discovered a new marker planted just beyond my campsite. It bore my name. The letters were engraved cleanly, without corrosion, followed by a date that had not yet occurred. I did not touch it. I packed quickly and moved downhill, choosing a route that bypassed all known marker locations. Within an hour, I noticed additional rods protruding from the ground at regular intervals, forming a loose line through the forest. Some were old, some were new, all were aligned. They were mapping something. As I followed the line unintentionally, the forest around me felt subtly altered. Trees leaned inward at odd angles. Rocks appeared placed rather than scattered. The ground underfoot felt compacted, pressed flat by weight that had nothing to do with erosion. I reached a clearing that did not exist on any map. At its center stood a tall stone monument, shaped like a survey obelisk, carved with hundreds of names, dates, and coordinates. Some names were scratched out. Others were deeply etched, as if reinforced over time. I recognized one. It belonged to a man who had gone missing in the area years earlier, a surveyor whose case had never been resolved. As I stepped closer, I felt an overwhelming pressure, like standing at the center of intersecting lines that defined more than property. I understood then that the markers were not mapping land. They were recording presence, claiming it. The metallic sounds returned, louder now, closer. The ground vibrated faintly beneath my boots. I turned and ran. Markers rose from the earth as I fled, appearing in my path, redirecting me, narrowing my options. Each one bore a different name, a different date, all tied to people who had walked these woods and never left. I broke through the tree line just as dusk settled, emerging onto an old service road. The sounds stopped instantly. The forest behind me looked normal again, unmarked, unmeasured. I did not return to finish the survey. Weeks later, my supervisor called to tell me the anomaly markers could not be located. No evidence of unauthorized surveying was found. My final report was archived without comment. Sometimes, late at night, I wake with the sensation of being counted, measured, logged. I have not set foot in the Appalachians since. Some boundaries are not meant to be confirmed. I learned early in my career that the Appalachian Mountains keep old infrastructure longer than maps do. Roads vanish into trees, rail beds turn into walking paths, and bridges rot quietly until they are forgotten. That was why I took the contract to document abandoned crossings along a flood-prone river system in the central Appalachians. It was boring work, but it mattered. Old bridges kill people when they collapse. The bridge I am writing about was not listed anywhere. I first saw it on a fog-heavy morning in late October. I had parked near a washed-out access road and followed the river on foot, marking erosion points and photographing culverts. The fog was thick enough that visibility dropped to about 30 yards, the kind that dampens sound and makes distances feel wrong. I noticed the bridge because it broke the line of trees ahead of me. At first, I assumed it was a modern footbridge hidden by fog. As I approached, I saw that it was older, built from dark timber and iron supports, spanning the river at a narrow bend. The structure was narrow, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, with no guardrails and a deck slick with moisture. There were no warning signs, no barricades, no indication it had ever been maintained. I checked my map. There was no crossing marked there. The river beneath it flowed fast and cold, swollen from recent rain. The bridge stood low, close enough to the water that spray dampened the planks. I photographed it, logged the coordinates, and made a note to report it. Halfway across, the fog thickened. The far end of the bridge faded from view, swallowed by gray. I felt a sudden urge to turn back, but I ignored it. I had crossed worse structures than this. When I reached the opposite side, I stepped onto packed earth and looked back. The bridge was gone. I do not mean hidden by fog. I mean the space where it had stood was empty. The river flowed uninterrupted, banks unbroken, as if no structure had ever crossed there. I stood there longer than I should have, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that I had crossed at a bend and lost perspective. Eventually, logic won. I retraced my steps downstream until I reached a familiar marker and followed the river back to my truck. That night, I reviewed the photos. Every image showed the same thing: fog, trees, water, no bridge. I returned 2 days later with a colleague named Aaron. The fog rolled in again before noon, thick and low. We followed the river together. When the bridge appeared, Aaron stopped short. "That wasn't there last time," he said. I asked him what he meant. "I surveyed this stretch 2 years ago," he said. "There was no crossing." We stood at the edge, staring at the structure. The fog pressed in from both sides, muffling sound. The river beneath us sounded distant, like it was flowing farther away than it should have been. Aaron refused to cross. I did. Halfway across, I noticed something wrong with the planks. They were worn smooth in the center, not by tires or boots, but by dragging. Long, shallow grooves ran lengthwise, as if something heavy had been pulled across repeatedly. Near the midpoint, I felt vibration through the soles of my boots, not movement, not collapse. A steady, rhythmic pressure, like footsteps traveling beneath the deck. I froze. The fog thinned just enough for me to see shapes beneath the bridge, pale forms moving against the current, not carried by it, but working through it with purpose. I ran the rest of the way. When I reached the far bank, I turned back and shouted for Aaron. My voice sounded wrong, flattened and distant. He stood on the opposite side, visible only as a shadow through the fog. He shook his head and backed away. Then the bridge creaked. The sound did not come from strain. It came from adjustment, like a structure settling into place. The fog thickened instantly, swallowing Aaron's silhouette. I heard footsteps on the planks. They moved toward me slowly, evenly spaced, heavier than any human stride. I backed away, heart hammering, watching as the fog bulged around the center of the bridge, distorted by approaching mass. Something spoke. It did not form words. It formed rhythm, cadence, the shape of language without meaning. The sound vibrated in my chest more than my ears. I ran into the trees. I did not stop until I reached the road. Aaron never came back. Search teams found no sign of him, no tracks, no gear, no reason for him to vanish. Officially, he was presumed to have fallen into the river upstream. I know that is not what happened. Weeks later, I returned alone during clear weather. The river flowed normally. There was no bridge, no marks, no indication anything had ever crossed there, until fog rolled in. As the mist thickened, the outline of the bridge emerged slowly, solidifying piece by piece. This time, I did not approach. I watched as shapes moved beneath the surface of the water, gathering near the crossing. The bridge did not appear for travelers. It appeared to collect them. I filed my final report and resigned shortly after. Some crossings in the Appalachians are not meant to connect two sides. They are meant to decide who does not cross back. I spent 12 years working emergency communications for rural counties across the Central Appalachians. My job was not dramatic. I maintained repeater stations, calibrated antennas, checked dead zones, and responded when volunteer fire departments or ranger stations lost signal. Most people assume radio work is clean and technical, but out there it becomes something else. Terrain bends sound, mountains swallow frequencies, and sometimes signals come back wrong. The valley I am writing about was known to every dispatcher in the region, even though no one liked to talk about it. Officially, it was just a low-lying area between two ridges where signal propagation behaved unpredictably. Unofficially, it was the place where radios never stayed quiet. I was sent there in early spring after a series of complaints from multiple agencies. Fire crews reported hearing traffic that did not belong to any active unit. Rangers claimed their radios transmitted without being keyed. One dispatcher swore she heard a distress call from a station that had been shut down for years. At first, everyone assumed interference. Old equipment, atmospheric conditions, solar activity. Those explanations cover most problems, and I wanted them to be correct. The access road into the valley was barely maintained. It wound downhill through dense forest, the canopy closing overhead until the sky disappeared entirely. By the time I reached the bottom, the air felt heavier, damp and still, as if the valley trapped it. I parked near an old repeater tower that had been decommissioned but never dismantled. The structure leaned slightly, its metal frame streaked with rust. According to records, it had been offline for nearly a decade. My handheld radio crackled the moment I stepped out of the truck. At first, it was only static, but beneath it ran a faint pattern, rhythmic and deliberate. I adjusted the dial, expecting to isolate the source. Instead, the pattern sharpened into voices. They were speaking calmly, professionally, using proper call signs and protocols. None of them belonged to any active unit. I recognized one immediately. It was a dispatcher I had worked with years earlier. She had retired after a stroke and passed away not long after. Her voice came through the radio exactly as I remembered it, steady and precise, mid-sentence, as if I had tuned into an ongoing shift. I froze. I checked the frequency. It was not assigned to anything. I cycled power. The transmission continued uninterrupted. As I listened, more voices joined in. Rangers reporting trail conditions, fire crews coordinating a response, EMS units calling in transport times. Everything sounded routine, efficient, normal. The only problem was the timestamps. They were wrong. The radio traffic referenced incidents that had occurred years ago. Some had ended badly. Others had never been resolved. I shut the radio off and the voices stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt unnatural, as if something had been cut off mid-thought. I powered it back on. The voices resumed exactly where they had left off. I climbed the tower to inspect the old equipment. The repeater housing was locked, untouched. Power lines had been disconnected long ago. There was no way it should have been transmitting, let alone receiving. Inside the valley, sound behaved strangely. My boots on gravel sounded distant. When I spoke aloud, my voice felt flattened, like it was being absorbed by the air itself. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. As evening approached, the radio traffic changed. The routine chatter slowed. Gaps appeared between transmissions. Voices repeated themselves, correcting phrases, reissuing instructions that had already been acknowledged. The calm professionalism began to fray. Then I heard my own voice. It came through clearly, using my call sign, reporting my position in the valley, and requesting a signal check. The cadence matched my speech perfectly, down to the slight pause I always made before giving coordinates. I had not keyed the mic. My chest tightened. I shut the radio off again, heart pounding, and sat in the truck until full dark. I considered leaving then and there, but stubbornness and training held me in place. Equipment malfunctions do not fix themselves by avoidance. I decided to set up monitoring equipment overnight. As darkness settled fully, the valley changed. The forest beyond the reach of my headlights seemed to press inward, reducing depth and distance. Sound carried farther through the radio than through the air. Every transmission felt closer than it should have been. Around midnight, the traffic shifted again. The voices began calling for help. Not panicked, not screaming, but strained, urgent, as if holding themselves together out of habit. Dispatchers repeated instructions that were never acknowledged. Units reported locations that no longer existed. Some calls ended abruptly, cut off mid-word. I recognized several names. They belonged to people who had died in the line of duty. My radio vibrated faintly in my hand, growing warmer with each transmission. I set it down on the seat and stepped out of the truck, needing distance. From somewhere deep in the valley, I heard a sound that did not come through the radio. It was the echo of radio traffic, delayed and distorted, carried faintly through the trees. Voices overlapped, bled together, lost clarity. The valley itself was repeating what it had absorbed. I realized then that the valley was not generating the transmissions. It was storing them. Every call that had ever passed through that low ground, every emergency, every final transmission had sunk into it, layered over time. The repeater tower had not created the phenomenon. It had only amplified it. Around 2 a.m, the radio keyed itself again. My voice came through, strained now, breath audible, reporting escalating interference and requesting immediate extraction. The transmission repeated 3 times, each version slightly worse than the last, as if degrading. I backed away from the truck. The radio continued anyway. Then another voice broke through, one I did not recognize. It addressed me directly by name. It told me to stay calm, told me help was on the way, told me to remain in the valley so my signal could be located. I knew better than to answer. As dawn approached, the transmissions grew chaotic. Voices overlapped, protocols abandoned, distress bleeding into confusion. The radio screamed with unresolved calls, each one pulling at attention, demanding response. I packed quickly. As I drove uphill, the signal weakened. The voices stretched, slowed, lost cohesion. At the ridgeline, they cut off completely. The silence was immediate and complete. Back at the office, my report was met with polite skepticism. Atmospheric conditions, equipment malfunction, stress. The valley was flagged for further study, but no one seemed eager to return. A month later, another technician went down there. He never came back. Search teams found his truck at the bottom of the valley. The doors were open. The radio inside was still powered on. It was transmitting. When dispatch tuned into the frequency, they heard a calm, steady voice reporting equipment status and requesting routine checks. It was his voice. The valley remains classified as a signal dead zone. Officially, no anomalous activity has been confirmed. The repeater tower still stands, though it is no longer listed in maintenance schedules. Sometimes late at night when radio traffic is light, I hear faint echoes beneath active channels. Old calls, familiar voices, fragments of emergencies that never fully resolved. I always switch frequencies immediately. Some places in the Appalachians do not let go of what they hear. They keep listening. I worked search and rescue for nearly 9 years across several Appalachian counties, long enough to learn that the mountains do not lose people the way cities do. Out there, disappearances follow patterns. Someone slips on a wet slope, someone misjudges daylight, someone wanders off trail and panics. Even when a body is never found, the search area eventually stops growing. The case I am writing about did not. It began with a missing hiker report in late September, just after the first cold nights settled into the higher elevations. The subject was a man in his early 30s, experienced, properly equipped, last seen entering a marked loop trail that should have taken him no more than 6 hours to complete. When he failed to check in by nightfall, rangers initiated protocol. By dawn, our team was mobilized. The trailhead was quiet when we arrived. His car sat alone in the lot, locked, nothing unusual inside. We established last known point at the main junction where the loop split north and south. There were clear boot prints heading north. We followed them. For the first mile, everything made sense. His stride length was steady, no signs of panic, no deviation from the trail. Then, without warning, the print stopped, not faded, not scattered, stopped. The ground ahead was soft enough to hold tracks, yet there was nothing. No sign he had stepped off, no disturbance of leaves. It was as if he had been lifted straight up. We expanded the search radius and continued. By the second day, more teams joined in. Dogs were brought in, aerial support scanned ridges and drainages. Nothing turned up, not a scrap of gear, not a broken branch. What bothered me was the scale. Each time we extended the perimeter, the last sign of the hiker appeared again at the new edge. A footprint, a snapped twig, a scuffed rock, always recent, always leading farther out. It did not matter which direction we pushed. The boundary followed us. I noticed it first when I reviewed the GPS tracks that night. Our coverage should have overlapped. Instead, each team's data showed the same anomaly, signs appearing just beyond where we had searched, as if the missing man stayed perpetually one step ahead. On day 3, one of the volunteers went missing. She was part of a grid team working downhill toward a creek. Her radio transmission cut off mid-sentence. When we reached her last position, her pack lay neatly on the ground. Her boots were placed beside it, toes pointing downhill. There were no tracks leading away. We shifted immediately from single-subject to multi-subject search. Resources doubled. Command grew tense. That was when the map began to change. I do not mean physically, I mean operationally. Every time we drew a boundary, something pushed it outward. Terrain that should have ended the search presented new drainages. Ridges unfolded into additional spurs that were not on any topographic chart. Paths appeared that none of us remembered hiking before. Veteran team members started checking compasses obsessively. Bearings drifted, distances stretched. A mile uphill felt like 2. Radio check-ins lagged, voices arriving slightly delayed, as if the air itself resisted transmission. On the 5th night, I overheard a transmission that was not meant for me. A calm voice reported a location and requested extraction. The call sign matched the original missing hiker. Command dismissed it as interference. I did not. The next morning, we found fresh boot prints near camp. They matched his boots exactly. The prints circled our staging area once, careful and deliberate, then led into the trees. Several team members refused to follow. By day 7, exhaustion set in. People grew short-tempered. Small mistakes crept in. One man walked in a straight line for nearly an hour and ended up back where he started, convinced he had been climbing the entire time. At briefing that night, our search area had grown to more than triple its original size. No one could explain why. That was when I realized something was wrong with the premise of the operation. We were not searching for people who were lost. We were being repositioned. The search area was not expanding because we were missing clues. It was expanding because whatever held those people did not want us to reach an edge. I shared my concern quietly with another team lead. He did not laugh. He admitted he had noticed the same thing. He told me he felt like the mountains were rearranging themselves around us, subtly, patiently. On the 8th day, Command ordered a final push toward a steep basin none of us had entered yet. The terrain there was difficult but not impassable. We descended in staggered teams. The basin was wrong. Sound behaved oddly. Shouts carried too far, then cut off abruptly. The air felt thick, stale. At the bottom, we found something that made several people drop to their knees. The missing hiker stood there. So did the volunteer. So did 2 others we had not yet officially classified as missing. They were standing in a loose cluster, facing outward, eyes open, breathing shallow but steady. They did not respond to voices or touch. Their radios were clipped neatly to their packs, all powered on. Every radio transmitted the same thing, static layered with faint breathing. As we approached, the ground beneath us shifted, not visibly but perceptibly, like stepping onto a surface that was not solid. The basin widened, the slopes pulled back, the trees leaned away. The search area expanded again. Someone screamed. I do not know who started running first. I only know that when I looked back, the basin was larger than it had been moments before, the figures now farther away, already receding. We ran uphill until our lungs burned and our legs shook. When we finally broke free of the basin, the forest snapped back into place. The radios fell silent. Command called off the operation the next morning. Officially, due to unsafe conditions and lack of viable leads. Unofficially, because the search area could not be contained. The missing were never recovered. Their cases remain open, frozen in time. Sometimes when I look at satellite imagery of that region, I notice subtle discrepancies. Valleys slightly wider than before, ridges that do not align the way they should. The mountains did not take those people by accident. They were added. Some search areas are not meant to be closed. They are meant to grow. I spent most of my adult life working as a backcountry ranger in the Appalachian Mountains, assigned to sections of trail that rarely made it into brochures or guidebooks. These were not the postcard views or crowded overlooks. They were the long, quiet stretches between destinations. The kind of places where hikers disappear, not because of cliffs or weather, but because no one is watching closely enough. One of my routine responsibilities was maintaining trail registers, simple wooden boxes at trailheads or junctions, stocked with notebooks where hikers wrote their names, dates, and intended routes. They served practical purposes. If someone went missing, we knew where to start looking. Most entries were boring. Names, mileage goals, occasional jokes. The register I am writing about did not behave that way. It sat at the junction of two older trails in a remote Appalachian hollow, both lightly used, neither officially closed. The box itself was unremarkable, weathered pine with a rusted hinge, positioned beside a split oak that had been struck by lightning years earlier. I checked it once every 2 weeks, replacing pages when they filled and removing trash people stuffed inside. The first anomaly appeared in early spring. While reviewing the latest entries, I noticed a name written at the bottom of a page in neat, careful handwriting. The problem was not the name itself. It was the date. It was tomorrow's. At first, I assumed someone had made a mistake or thought they were being clever. People do that. But when I checked the previous pages, I found something worse. The same handwriting appeared again and again, scattered throughout the notebook, always near the end of a page, always dated 1 or 2 days after my last visit. Different names, different routes, always future dates. I checked the carbon copy in my logbook. None of those hikers had checked in at nearby stations. None had registered permits. Several of the names sounded vaguely familiar, but I could not place them. I flagged the register for follow-up. Over the next month, reports came in of hikers failing to check out along those trails. Nothing dramatic at first. Missed check-ins, delayed returns, the sort of thing that usually resolved itself, until one didn't. A woman in her mid-40s failed to return from a 3-day solo hike. Her car sat at the trailhead. Her gear list had been filed properly. She was experienced. The register showed her name, written clearly, dated 2 days after I had last checked it. She had never signed in. Search teams were deployed. Dogs picked up a scent that led directly past the register, down the eastern branch of the trail, and then simply stopped. No disturbance, no sign she had left the path. That was when I returned to the register ahead of schedule. The notebook had been replaced. Not removed, replaced. The paper was newer, the cover unscuffed, the ink dark and fresh. The first page listed names in chronological order, all dated several days in the future. At the top was the missing woman's name, followed by the word completed written in the margin. I closed the box slowly. Over the following weeks, more hikers failed to return. Not many, just enough to avoid headlines. Every single one of them appeared in the register before they ever arrived. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Each name appeared once, always clean handwriting, always correct trail routes, always dated after my previous inspection. When the person vanished, the margin note appeared, sometimes completed, sometimes turned back, sometimes still in progress. No one else seemed to notice. Other rangers dismissed my concerns. They said I was overthinking coincidence. They said backcountry stress did strange things to perception. One supervisor suggested someone might be tampering with the register as a prank. I replaced the notebook myself and marked the pages discreetly so I could identify it later. 2 days later, the markings were gone. The handwriting returned. One entry caught my eye immediately. It was my name. The date was 3 days away. The route listed was the Eastern Branch Trail, ending at a location that did not officially exist. The margin was blank. I locked the register box and took the notebook with me. That night, my radio crackled with a transmission that did not come from any station. A calm voice reported a ranger moving through the Eastern Branch, describing landmarks only someone on foot would notice. The voice used my call sign incorrectly, 1 digit off, as if remembered rather than read. I did not answer. The next morning, I returned to the register. The lock was intact. Inside was a new notebook. My name was still there. The margin now read active. Against every rule I knew, I followed the Eastern Branch Trail alone. The forest felt wrong almost immediately. Not hostile, not threatening, simply attentive. Sounds behaved oddly. Footsteps sounded delayed. Bird calls echoed where they should not have. The trail itself felt subtly altered, bending just enough to disorient without alarming. After several miles, I found a clearing that was not on any map. At its center stood a long table made from rough timber. On it lay dozens of trail registers stacked neatly, each one labeled with a location. Some I recognized, others I did not. The notebooks were open, names filled the pages, thousands of them, dates spanning decades. Some entries were neat, others were frantic. Some pages ended mid-word. I found one register labeled with my station's name. My handwriting filled the last page. It described the clearing, the table, the realization. The margin note was written carefully, completed. I ran. The trail behind me stretched. Distances warped, landmarks repeated. I passed the same fallen log 3 times without changing direction. When I finally broke through the tree line, I collapsed near the road, shaking and exhausted. Officially, nothing was found in the eastern branch. No clearing, no table, no registers. The trail register at the junction was removed shortly afterward. The trails remain open. Hikers still go missing there, quietly, infrequently, just enough to avoid attention. Sometimes late at night, I dream of pages turning on their own, recording progress, marking completion.